This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to journalist Mike Giglio, and we're doing something a bit different. We're going to speak mainly about his experiences covering the war on ISIS that he's written about in his book. This is not an advertisement. He hasn't asked me to advertise anything. It's nothing like that. It's just I've been following Mike's work for a very long time. I think he's a very good journalist, and he's written this book, Shatter the Nations, and it's all about the fights against ISIS, but from an on-the-ground perspective. And he's going to be speaking to us about why that is so important. There are too many so-called experts running around who have actually never, ever even been in the countries they're talking about. Mike has been to all of the front lines and has seen it all from the ground up. If you like what we're doing, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/popularfront. All right, Mike. So I normally I wouldn't do this, but the book looks really interesting from the small part I've read, and from what I've spoken to friends about it. Maybe you can explain about this new book you've got coming out, Shatter the Nations.
Yeah, happy to. It's based on 6 years of my reporting from Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and it's the story of the rise and fall of the caliphate that ISIS declared. And what's different, I think, about this book is that every chapter is through on-the-ground reporting. So the book tells part of the story through ISIS and the smugglers and the traffickers that were working for it, and then you kind of go on the other side of the mirror in the chapters with the soldiers who were fighting ISIS. And so the real protagonists of the book, I think, are the Iraqi Special Operations Forces and the Kurdish counterterrorism units that really led the fight on behalf of America and Europe.
Yeah, let's maybe talk about the smugglers a little bit first, actually, because I read one of your pieces recently. I forget who it was for. It wasn't a new piece, but it was about the smugglers in Turkey, or at least on the border, helping ISIS kind of get past and get into Turkey. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big part of my life when I lived in Turkey, was going down to southern Turkey, which is right on the border with northern Syria, and was kind of and still is really the gateway for the rest of the world to ISIS and the war in Syria. And I think that the story you read, I actually did in 2017. So by that point, I've been doing this for about 5 years, getting to know the smugglers and the traffickers who operate down there. Over the course of the entire conflict with ISIS, they sort of use this underground economy and these smuggling and trafficking networks to do everything from selling oil and selling artifacts to bringing people into Syria, from all over the world. And then what was happening in 2017, as the U.S. and the Kurds in Syria were closing in on Raqqa and making their last push to take back the rest of ISIS territory, was ISIS was sending fighters back out again using the same smuggling networks. And so they were able to have a lot of their fighters and senior members escape into Turkey, and then from Turkey they can go elsewhere into the world, join up with their affiliates in Libya or in Africa or in Asia, or sort of just kind of wait out the storm.
Right, and you actually met some of the smugglers, right? You interviewed them face to face.
Yeah, that was I did that for years.
How was that? What are they like? Because I think people have this idea that, smugglers are these kind of bandits. I've met people smugglers in the Middle East. They're just normal guys that you would think drive a taxi.
I mean, they are, right? Smugglers remind me of journalists. And, I think we're sort of naturally get along because they tend to present to the world like regular people. And then they also, are really comfortable just breaking rules where they can. And so... for example, the reason I think and I explain this in the book, the reason I think ISIS has been so good about using smuggling networks and surviving is that, it's actually really rare that a smuggler will just work for ISIS. They're able to tap people on the edges of the conflict who just want to make money. And because so many people in Syrians especially are desperate, there's a really big smuggling economy. And so, some of the guys I know are just they used to be tradesmen or like low grade criminals or some combination of that, like before the war. And now they're, trying to keep their families afloat on the border.
Right. They don't give a shit about the terrorism. They don't care about how it's going to affect anyone else. They're just like, yeah, got to make money.
I mean, the ones that like are really good for ISIS are the ones that like kind of vaguely support the idea of an Islamic State. They actually kind of remind me sometimes of like Republicans with Trump, where they're like, yeah, what they're pushing for ISIS is good, but they take it too far. They're like too extreme. Like I knew a lot of guys like that. So they're like an Islamic State's a good idea actually, and ISIS, it's good of them to try to push for one, but they've really gone astray, and they need to be reined in. So that's
the understatement of the year. They went a bit too far.
Yeah. I mean, especially because I'm talking mostly. If you look at what my vantage point is. I lived in Istanbul and I worked in southern Turkey, so a lot of my sources were Syrians, and they really had like a special kind of view on ISIS, right? Because ISIS is an Iraqi organization first and foremost, and Syrians always had this idea that they're sort of second-class citizens in ISIS. So that even among like ISIS defectors I met who were Syrians, they always had like a little bit of extra like detachment from the group because Syrians just got punished by the group, I think, more than anybody else.
Right. You say about defectors. I mean, how seriously had they defected? Do you think when they just like, we're done because they want to kind of get away?
It depends. I mean, I in the book there's a chapter on defectors, and based on one particular story that I thought was really compelling, and in this case it was a Syrian who was just like a university student when the war started, chasing girls, smoking cigarettes, not like a radical guy at all. And then gradually as the Civil War went on, he fell into extremism just because. It seemed, I guess you could sort of see it from his perspective, like his family was getting killed in airstrikes and there was looting and there was just like complete disorder. And all of a sudden ISIS comes and they say, we're going to impose order, eye for an eye, code of justice, like, cut off a thief's hand if he steals, like that. And he found that very appealing when he was like at his lowest point. And from there, like really radicalized to the point where he was actually part of the Yazidi genocide. He was a field commander for ISIS, and he went into Sinjar with like the first wave of ISIS troops that took it in Iraq in 2014.
Jesus, that's quite a jump.
Yeah, and, but so what happened though is like he witnessing that massacre like shocked him, And it was like it convinced him, like it's almost like I think of it like you're dreaming and all of a sudden you wake up and you're like, holy shit, where's my brain been, in the middle, from like waking up from a nightmare. And so he, by the time he left ISIS, he was completely against the group and still is, and he just almost from like how like people who are like Catholic sometimes become like the most ardent atheists. There are ISIS defectors like that, and like he was, where because he's seen it up close and because he'd been, sort of brainwashed by ISIS, he was really against it by the time he left. But in the story that we were discussing earlier, like in 2017, when people were escaping because the caliphate's falling apart and U.S. troops are, and Kurdish soldiers are like closing in on Raqqa. Those guys, I think, it was really like a mix. Like a lot of them were just, hey, it's this isn't going well, so we're going to leave. And when you're in the community of Syrian refugees in Turkey, you should say you're a defector because that community really is anti-ISIS.
Right. Yeah. It makes it a lot easier, for those.
Yeah. You don't want to say you're still supporting them.
Yeah. Exactly. One thing that this is why I wanted to talk to you so much, and you mentioned it yourself at the start. All of your work is based from the ground. Now, I don't want to get, I do enough moaning on Twitter, but I do think there's a huge problem where so-called experts who've never stepped foot in Syria often get the biggest voice when it comes to reporting on ISIS and what have you. So maybe you can tell us, what kind of advantage do you think you've had from actually reporting all of this from the ground and for so long as well?
Yeah, it was when I haven't been in the region for 2 years. Like I completely burned out, as you might sense if you finish the book. And so I moved here 2 years ago, and I've just been writing the book and based out of DC. And when the news in Syria started, I felt like I shouldn't say anything, because I haven't been out there in 2 years. But I, like you're mentioning, I realized that so much of the discussion, especially even like from the U.S. government and like their bully pulpit, is led by people who have absolutely no experience at all. overseas. And so I did end up, doing some stories and some coverage, just being like, well, at least, I did manage to spend, all this time over there and still relevant knowledge. But there's definitely like that kind of, I feel it myself like that, you could feel how it's easy to slip into like the world of like bullshit pontificator,
But, it's very weird. Sorry, I was just gonna say, it's very weird to me. I don't know if there was ever a point in time where someone could say, I am an expert on this, having never been, let alone into the region where the war is, but not even into the country. Like, I can't get my head around it. There are things, yourself more than even I do, that there are things you'll see at war that just tell you, like, even the way someone perhaps moves their face as they talk about something, you know what I mean, can tell you so much more than what they're actually saying. It's like, come on, like with a thing like war, I really think you have to at least be around for a bit of it. Yeah,
and also like I'm not an expert. I don't, and if if anyone never sees me call myself one, like come and kick my ass, please. But like,
exactly.
But like really, like and if you the way I did my work overseas and the way the book is focused, is really like if I was writing about something, like I had to see it. Because I just think if you don't, you miss stuff, especially in a war zone. And so like if I did oil smuggling as a topic, I would spend, I think I spent 3 months straight on that story, and I wouldn't write it unless I went and actually watched where ISIS was smuggling oil, because I was like, otherwise I can't understand it, right? And actually, so like the result of that was that I understood not only how it worked and had, a credibility to my sources who were talking to me and ultimately led me there, but also to like, we had photos, we had videos, we really showed what it looked like. But like, if you looked at the reports and the statements from the U.S. government about ISIS oil smuggling, you would probably think it's like this big professional operation, and they have like, gleaming like oil tankers bringing the oil across the border from Syria. It was so the opposite of that. It was just like gritty.
Well, tell us, like, what did you see? What was it like, the ISIS oil smuggling?
Yeah, we get in a car, in a van. I had a driver who had this like soccer mom style like green minivan that was just, you would think it could be like a like a mom or a dad bringing their kids to practice, except that it was just completely dusty and beat to hell. And we get in this van, and like I'm sitting in the back with my photographer, and we're just hoping nobody notices us. And we drive to with the smugglers to where the oil is kind of coming across the border. And it's a town that is like right on the border, where they have a decades-long history of smuggling, because
on the border with who? Sorry,
with Syria,
and, because between Turkey and Syria.
Between Turkey and Syria, and they. As soon as we enter like this, it's literally like a dead end road. Like it winds through the town and then it ends at the border. You can't, so there's only one way in, and then you have to go back out the same way, which is actually quite scary if you're trying to sneak in, because there's like not really a way out if they catch you. And so as soon as we get on the road, it's like what strikes me is there's garbage everywhere, like piled up on the street, and it was because the people who control the town, there's like a mafia family that controlled the town, wouldn't even let the garbage collectors in, right? Like no representative of the government is allowed to come into this town. And so that, like, just seeing that right there tells you a lot, right? It tells you that there's some level of local corruption going on. It tells you that the Turkish government, local government, is purposely turning a blind eye to what's happening there, because they're not even sending garbage collectors. And then, so then we get to the end of as we're driving along the road, we see like it's kind of like your traditional like squat stone houses, at the beginning of the town or the village. And then as you get closer, like the walls start getting bigger. You start seeing like 2-story houses, new construction. And there was a gate open, like, they have like, I saw like a Mercedes or a BMW brand new behind one of the gates. And so you can start to realize, how much profit they're making from this trade, and how it's like sort of like this, like very small town local mafia style of like glitz that they're pumping up now. And then when we got there, like it's like it was these pipes like the size of your fist, like a hydra heads, like coming up from under the dirt, that were pouring out the oil like really slowly, and like the guys that were they were filling up like these dusty jerry cans. And they're covered in grime, and like there was like a bus, like one of these mini buses that goes around the region, and they had like outfitted it with extra tanks so they could hold a lot of oil, and they were filling it up. And I mean, part of the insight I got from that, and from other work like this where I did similar stuff with like antiquities trading, was like what ISIS's strength is the desperation of the war. Like they are tapping into like low level operations and desperation in towns like this all across the border, rather than having like one big gleaming operation that you could hit with an airstrike. And so like, what I learned from that is just sort of the way that ISIS is always going to sort of be able to exist and to tap networks like this, as long as there's enough desperation to go around. And I think that, I would have thought of it much differently had I not gone and seen it.
Yeah, of course. It always seems different until you see it. And were the oil guys, were they like working, I don't know, were they like ISIS oil people, or were they just like locals that have been forced to work for them, or had to work for them just to make money, or what? What was the operation like?
The operation, so I only saw the Turkish side. The operation on the Turkish side was like people who work for the local like family/mafia that controlled that town. And they, so the ISIS link is just financial there. And they had been doing that, like whoever controlled the oil at the time, like they would do the same operation. So it's just like they're just shifting with whoever's in control at the time. And then it was similar with like artifact smuggling. Like it's like the people who were selling artifacts, in some cases ISIS had their own people who were trading it and digging for antiquities and stuff. But like a lot of them were like people who would buy artifacts from ISIS. They would buy artifacts from the regime. They would buy artifacts from the FSA, the rebel group that the U.S. backed. Like it didn't really matter to them.
Right. And where was the oil being sold? To who?
Just it all disappeared into the filling stations around southern Turkey. So they mix it in with the regular fuel so it's like local corruption, like for the most part, like little filling stations just kind of cutting their own fuel with it, because Turkey has really high fuel prices. Also, like as I was driving around doing this investigation for 3 months with this driver in this minivan, he only used smuggled oil to drive, because it was cheaper. And so he actually had like this encyclopedic memory of every black market. They also had like their own black market filling station. So you could go to the normal one and get like the oil cut with Syrian oil, or you could go and, or the fuel cut with Syrian fuel, or you can go to like, like there'd be like a Syrian restaurant, and then behind the restaurant would be like a little stand, and there'd be like a dude sleeping in a shack, and he'd like bang on the door, and the guy would come out with the fuel. So it was also that sort of underground economy.
Yeah, I remember in Jizra 2015 when we first went, the Kurds were doing the same thing basically. They had like you go to the border back then, the big wall and that wasn't there, and there's just like two lads just like drive around the bit, and they throw a tarpaulin up. You know what I mean? It's fascinating.
So you could look at something like that and say, oh, so it's not that big of a deal for ISIS, right? Or because it's not such a sexy looking thing.
Exactly.
But like the flip side of that is like, no, actually this kind of like very widespread low grade smuggling is actually much harder to stop than like a big operation. And that's I think part of ISIS's genius, is tapping into stuff like that.
Yeah, and it is everywhere. Like I remember, I think in southeast Turkey, I think it's something like the unemployment is 3 times worse there than anywhere else. So for a lot of them, it's the only way they can make money. Do you know what I mean? And obviously they're smuggling the oil from Rojava, from the Kurds, rather than ISIS. But there are poor people everywhere, all over that border. Do you know what I mean? That whole region. It's not a good situation.
Right. So it's like stopping the problem is not like bombing oil refineries necessarily. Like it's like fixing the war itself, right? So as long as there's this instability, ISIS has a foothold.
Yeah, definitely. Mike, you spoke about the Iraqi special forces that you were embedded with. And you said they're kind of fallen apart, or at least their unit been taken apart. Tell us about them, because I know they feature heavily in Shatter the Nations. Yeah, so
in Mosul, myself and a photographer embedded with the lead unit of the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, and so it's basically like the most elite battalion of soldiers in Iraq. And these are guys that were founded, this unit was founded in 2005 by U.S. Green Berets and Special Operations troops, because they needed people to go and kick down doors with them and do roll up ISIS or Al Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS's predecessors' networks during the Iraq War. So some of these guys that I was with had been working alongside U.S. troops or fighting America's wars in one way or another for, I think at that point, like 12 years, almost straight. And it's kind of important to understand their background. Like, these are, if you think like these are, I say they're Iraqi Special Operations Troops, like that's the name of their, the overall division is ISAF. And this is like their equivalent, especially the battalion I was with, was like their equivalent of like SEAL Team 6 or the Delta Force, where they're really designed to just do really specific high value target raids, like go and get like a Baghdadi style figure or someone really high up in the chain of command, or do hostage rescues and things like that. But when ISIS came and invaded Iraq from Syria in 2014 and took Mosul, I think people forget now, like they were like on the edge of Baghdad. Like there was a real risk. I was in Baghdad at the time. There was a real risk that they were going to take like the whole country, because the Iraqi military just collapsed and they were tearing off their uniforms and it was a complete disaster. The only people who really like held the line were these special operations forces. And they went from kind of years of doing just really well-planned, well-executed missions like the Delta Force would, to all of a sudden just being in the middle of like street fights. And so you had soldiers who had been, survived for like a decade, and units that had taken very little casualties over a decade because they were so careful in their planning, all of a sudden losing like 10 people at a time into like an IED. And so it was just like a real like disaster for them, but they were the only people who would do it. And by the time I went with them in 2014, they had basically just accepted that they were like a ground force. And because the Iraqi military, despite all this extra U.S. training that had been poured into the country and money, were still so weak, they were still relying on these guys to be the tip of the spear into Mosul and to do most of the fighting. And so they would go in and clear neighborhoods, and then the Iraqi military later would come and just like kind of camp out there. And so those are the guys I was with. And by by the middle of the Mosul battle, they had taken so many casualties that they just like wounded soldiers were just like continuing to fight. And if they were a U.S. unit, they would have been like months earlier pulled back because they would have been considered combat ineffective.
Right. Yeah. Not ideal at all. And what happened to them after the war?
I mean, they lost so many of their members of their officer corps who were, which is like the real strength of any unit, their mid-level officer corps. And they, were just like really decimated. And there's an effort now to rebuild them by the U.S., but I mean, it's really hard to account for the lost experience and retraining a group like that and getting them battle tested and giving them real experience. Like, it takes years. So there, I think like the story for them now is like they're just like really badly weakened, and like that was I think people sort of misunderstand, I think, what the war meant to ISIS for the caliphate. Like, I think you got to remember, like, at a certain point, like, ISIS knew it wasn't going to hold Mosul and Raqqa. Like, this was not going to last. They have such a long-term vision, though, that, they wanted, their goal became not holding these cities for the long term, but making the battle as bloody as possible, as destructive as possible, and killing as many of the soldiers, like the guys I was with, so that they would face less pressure from them, 5 years, 10 years down the line. So they were trying there was a real effort to like kill as many U.S. allies as you can. And unfortunately, they were really successful at that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions, specifically in what happened in Mosul as well, Obviously, there were some horrific situations where U.S. forces, planes bombed civilian areas, just flattened them. But obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. Maybe you can talk on your time actually in the battle for Mosul.
Yeah, I did a lot of reporting on civilian casualties too. And, I would say like it also, how deadly the battle was for civilians depended on, to a large extent on which Iraqi force was fighting in an area. So the guys that I was with, they really, and like, the kind of embeds I was doing, like where I'm actually at some point, like in the attacking convoys, like first, few Humvees into ISIS territory. They're not putting on a show for a reporter after a certain point, right? Like they're really just trying to like fight and not die.
Yeah, and it's like you're there.
Yeah, and like, going back to what I said earlier about really wanting to see it, like that, that's why I'm there and doing that kind of embed, because I really want to get an accurate picture as possible by seeing it with my own eyes, like what's happening. And they really actually took a lot of concern about civilians and trying not to cause an inordinate amount of civilian casualties. And they were calling in airstrikes, U.S. airstrikes as they went, but they were careful. And so they led the battle, especially in eastern Mosul, which was the first half of the city that was taken. And there were civilian casualties, right? And like I documented it, and I got the U.S. to admit to, I think, 36 civilian deaths from their strikes. But it was like, if you were in a neighborhood, it would be like, this house is standing, this house is standing, this one is collapsed. This house is standing, this house is standing, the next one's collapsed. So like, it was terrible. And some of the houses might have had ISIS fighters, and others might have had families where there was bad intelligence or an errant strike or what have you. But the residents appreciated that there had been care taken not to make the battle too deadly. And they were actually, because this destruction was bad but not overwhelming, they were able, like life was able to return to eastern Mosul like really quickly. Western Mosul, it was a different story. The forces that were leading that part of the battle, like the Iraqi special forces by that point had been so broken down that they only played they weren't the whole show like they were in the East, like they were just part of the equation. And then you had like the really unprofessional Iraqi units like the federal police, and there was a special like counterterrorism force that the Interior Ministry has. I forget their name. Yeah, the Emergency Response Division, the ERD, who were like committing atrocities as they went. And like those forces, like they didn't care to the same level, and the destruction was just so much worse. And also, I mean, the Eastern Mosul was the last battle of the Obama administration, and Western Mosul was the first battle of the Trump administration. And Trump, he likes to say that he defeated ISIS, but he really just followed the plan that had already been laid out, right? Like that, everything was already in motion by the time he took office. He didn't change anything, except, I mean, I'm sure he changed some things that, had like affected the battle and the pace on the edges, but like the overall strategy was already underway. One of the major changes that Trump made, though, was he loosened restrictions on airstrikes that had been intended to reduce civilian harm. And so because of that, because of the nature of the forces that were in Western Mosul, and because Western Mosul is just like denser terrain and where ISIS made its last stand, the picture was just so much different. Like it was really just like a hellscape. Like where in Eastern Mosul, I said like a house here and there might be destroyed. Western Mosul, just entire blocks, just completely shattered.
Mike, if you don't mind, maybe talk about, you were saying like you got burnt out, and I think it's something that we never really speak about on Popular Front, but it's actually something a lot of journalists feel. I felt it myself, definitely. You've done a hell of a lot more work out there than I have. I can't imagine what it was like, like, tell us about that. What do you mean by you got burnt out? Why did you have to kind of just move out of there?
I mean, I think just the intensity of covering a war as it like spirals for years and like every day seems to be worse than the next, like eventually it's an exhausting process, and also if I was trying to be so upfront in all this reporting, it ends up just taking a lot out of me, like emotionally and like physically, and so I don't know, as it's hard for a journalist ever to kind of like talk about this kind of stuff, because like I think it's like whatever I'm feeling or however tired I am, like it must be like so much less than anybody who's actually party to the war, right? Like I recount like a situation where we got car bombed and we should have died, right? Like the only reason the car bomb didn't hit us is because it caught its edge it got stuck as it was turning a corner to come and kill us. And like, after that, I was talking to my photographer, and it was like the closest call I ever had, but also like the last in like a long series of close calls. And I was like, I think I'm done, man. Like, I feel like I'm pushing my luck. I used up all my 9 lives, and like, to the point where like now I won't even drive without a seatbelt. Around my quiet neighborhood, because I just feel like I used up all my luck. But like, so, I feel burned out. But like, if you think about the soldiers I was with, I'm like, okay, I'm done, I'm out. They just go do the same thing every day, for months after that and for months before that. And so that like just like it's in the book actually. The very next day after this whole like dramatic thing where all of us in the Humvee were just literally like the car bombs coming at us and like it's bad when your gunner isn't firing. Like he literally he closed the hatch and came down and I looked at him. I was like, oh fuck, like if he gave up, like we're done because we were stuck against the berm. We couldn't go anywhere. And so I ended up staying at the base the next day with the photographer, just like kind of catching our breath. But the guys in the Humvee, the driver burst his eardrum in the explosion, so he stayed with us. But the two other guys that were with us, they went back out in the same Humvee. And like we're sitting there like having tea. I think it was like 12 or 1 o'clock the next day in the afternoon, and I just see a tow truck coming with our Humvee, and it's crumpled like a paper cup. And the guys told me what happened. Like they got chased again by a car bomb, like same scenario. And they ditched at the last minute, and they managed to. And the car bomb hit the Humvee, and would have killed them. They like literally like
Wait,
they
on
probably
foot?
had a couple
They
seconds to
literally
get out.
just run off on. They ditched it on foot. That's how they got away.
Yeah, they hit a.
Wow.
There's barricades and berms all over these neighborhoods. So they actually got chased through the streets for like 5 minutes. I think it sounded like.
Jesus Christ.
The car bomb these car bombs, by the way, they're like. I don't know like what you're thinking when I say car bomb, but they're
Up-armored
vehicles.
SVBIDs, right? The big Mad Max types.
Yeah, like Mad Max is really what it looks like. Like they're like up armored in factories. So they're like, I don't know what the car originally was, but they have these like big shiny armor on them, and they paint them actually this like gleaming like white color a lot of times because they want to look like a civilian vehicle to the drone feeds overhead. And then they have like steel across the windshield, so you can't even see who's driving them. And they're like really these kind of like horrible futuristic or dystopian looking things. But so these guys are getting chased by it, and they eventually like hit a dead end in a barricade, and they jumped out of the Humvee at the last second and dove behind a building. And they were all covered in dirt, and their hair was standing up and stuff, but they survived. But it's like. You could sit here as a reporter and be like, yeah, I've seen some shit or whatever. I've done some really dangerous stuff, but it's like it's such a small piece compared to what these guys are doing, And they were doing it every single day. So that day they came back, the Humvee's destroyed. The next day they go out again. The next day they go out again, and it was like that for them for like, 12 years, 13 years with like little pauses here and there when the fighting stopped or when the U.S. ended the war before the next one started.
Yeah, I mean, it is a cliched thing to say and everybody says it, but it is so true. Like the people there are going through that all the time. Like you said, it's like, right, my time's done, I'm out. Like even civilians can't go anywhere. It's like to rest is resting under the possibility of their home getting bombed. You know what I mean? It's a real nightmare. It really struck me actually when I was in Rojava like recently, and there was some guy there who was going on about his friend had died in the war, and obviously it's very sad, but he's like trying to appeal to these Kurds and like, poor me. And my friend said, like, look at this guy, like he's going on about this, like he's the only guy in the world, like every one of them has a martyr in their family. You know what I mean? It's like our fixer, her brother had died in the war, and it's like no one is there to be like, oh, look at me, so it is very, I don't know. There's a very different perspective I think you get from actually someone that lives there, and they have to live under it every day. I don't know how they do it. Basically, I really don't.
Yeah, no, I don't either. I mean, like I'm one of the characters in the book is actually I worked in Turkey with a Syrian journalist. Like we shared bylines, and I actually made him a character in the book because it's like he. His background is just his own background. He's from Daraa, where the protests started in Syria. Like he was tortured and like in an underground prison and all completely traumatized before he escaped
regime prison.
In regime prison, yeah. And like, so, even like as a journalist, like he's going through the same things, we're doing the same things together, but he has this whole crazy history of what happened to him. And like, every interview we're doing about what's happening in Syria is like about what's happening to his own country. Like I no matter how much I care about Syria or I have people I love who like him, who were affected by the war and like, this stuff really depresses me. But like, it's like you always have that distance, at least that it's like, it's not my country in the end. And so I think you get spared by far the worst of it. And also like, I use this in the book actually, like to say, the fact that I left shows, kind of like the problem with America and Britain and all these countries that fight in these places, like that you can, no matter how involved you think you are, you can always leave. And just the fact that you have that option will always make you approach the war differently.
Yeah.
And I think we see that, like why can the U.S. and its allies like never finish the job in Iraq and Syria? Because it's hard, and they lose interest at some point. We lose political will at some point, because ultimately it's a war of choice. No matter how much we think ISIS is a threat or why we went out there, like it's a war of choice. And like, I think there's some part of that in my own story, and like I think it kind of gets at the question of like, why can't we finish and actually solve the problem in these countries?
That's a really good point. Yeah, I never thought of it like that. It is, at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, fuck it, we're done, we're out, see you later. Like they can, like you said, they can just go anytime.
Yeah, and that's what I did, right? Like I'm here now, I'm safe, and like this is still going on.
Yeah, definitely. Mike, you have this really, I wouldn't say like completely unique, because other reporters have done this, of course, but like a really great perspective on the conflict from being on the ground and understanding it in all different parts. What do you make now of the current situation? And perhaps, I'm not asking you to predict anything, but where do you feel like this is all headed? This so-called war on ISIS that is allegedly finished.
I think it's not finished, unfortunately, and like you don't want to sound like somebody calling for a forever war, right? But I think you can say like, yeah, U.S. troops and U.S. presence shouldn't be out there forever, but you gotta at least finish the job. And to me, it's like, it's not just rolling up all the ISIS networks that exist in Syria and also Iraq, like, which is what the U.S. has been doing and what they need to continue doing if we're going to really see a lasting defeat of ISIS, but like rebuilding these areas. And like stabilizing them and really helping the government like take control back, but like none of that's happening, or like it's like the efforts are just not enough. So now the future of any U.S. backed stabilization efforts in Syria that were underway in Kurdish areas is completely in jeopardy. But like even in Iraq, where like the government has welcomed the U.S. troops and has invited them, it's much easier country than Syria to operate. Like there's still rubble in Sunni cities. Like these places are still destroyed. Like I was speaking to an Iraqi analyst at the Atlantic Council a couple weeks ago. He told me that there are still bodies beneath the rubble in a lot of places.
Oh yeah, Mosul especially. I
mean, that alone should tell you where the U.S. commitment really is, like how or to what level it really is at. Like they've tried to raise some money, they've made some efforts to like, do some stabilization work. But like, I mean, if America was really focused on trying to make a lasting, secure, stabilized situation in Iraq, like, I mean, would there still be people buried under rubble in the cities that you need to win like popular support back? Like it's like, and that's just like the one example. I mean, you can imagine the education system, the infrastructure system, the economy, all that is just still a mess in these places.
So what's different? Because if you look at Afghanistan, I mean, it's an absolute mess beyond all belief. But America has actually tried to do some of this rebuilding and all this state building kind of crap that they talk about. Why is that not really happening the same way in Iraq and Syria? Is it just too soon or what?
I mean, Iraq, they've been there forever.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah, of course.
One way or another, yeah. And also, like, I've never worked from Afghanistan, so I don't really know like myself like how to compare it that well. But like, from the perspective of Iraq, like America's been there off and on since 2003, and it just like it's a real testament to the fact that they just can't get it right. And I was asking, I'm actually writing an article about this. I'm going to publish it, I think, later this week or early next, about what is it that they keep getting wrong? And like, I don't know, it sounds like an easy journalist thing to say, I think, where you're like, it's fixing the actual like fundamental problems in these countries and kind of like acknowledging that it's partly America's responsibility to do that. So it's, education system, economic system, like, giving them political backing to really like shore up their government and to make it an effective government. Like those efforts have just never succeeded, and I don't think America has really. I don't think it's been the focus of U.S. efforts to the extent that like killing ISIS has been.
Yeah, but it's such a that's true. Like kill ISIS, but then you have this bizarre situation now where you got these with Turkey. I'm talking about in Rojava or northeast Syria, whatever, where like literally. The militias that they're sending in are employing the same kind of jihadist tactics. And I just think surely America realizes this is going to backfire eventually. You know, like, I mean, it's just mad.
I think every single person in the national security establishment in the U.S., or most of them, could have told you that this was going to be a disaster, with the Turkish incursion. With the fighters they back, with the fact that Erdogan is absolutely an irresponsible actor and has no ability to really govern well in Turkey, let alone in Syria, whatever he's trying to carve out as a protectorate. But at the end of the day, it's Trump who's making the call, right?
Is that what it is? To me, it seemed like he literally just made the call on his own without talking to anyone. But surely that can't be true. I mean,
that's as I see it playing out, like that's been the case. Like why is it that the U.S. military is all of a sudden saying, now we're going to stay in Syria with 600 troops? I said that today. And we're going to protect the oil facilities and all that. Because it's like, this was the damage control that they had to do after Trump's kind of like snap decision. And this is like what they could, salvage, basically. And it shows you that like everyone is reacting after the fact to Trump's decision. Like, if Trump had said like, hey, I'm going to pull out the troops on this date and given a clear deadline, they could have at least planned for it, right? But the way it played out, like the U.S. Special Operations troops were retreating. The word in the New York Times was retreating as the Turkey-backed fighters poured into the country, right? They poured into the Kurdish regions, right? Like this was not planned. They were they had to do airstrikes to destroy the ammunition they left behind.
Well, yeah, a French base even got shelled by Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's complete madness, and it showed really no planning whatsoever. And like, to the point that you're putting U.S. Lives at risk in the complete lack of planning. Like there was a story in the Times that said the Turkey-backed fighters had fired on retreating U.S. troops. Like I couldn't believe I was reading that. Like that's really something else.
It's incredible. Like, it's such a mess. I almost can't believe that it happened the way it happened,
Yeah, it was shocking.
I read that one of the SDF spokesmen, one of the main guys, commanders, found out on Twitter. Like, he just didn't even get told,
I mean, I remember when Trump killed the CIA program, which, by the way, is like, you could, at that point, not a controversial decision, right?
Yeah.
But like, the CIA program that had been backing the
arm and equip, right?
What's that?
The train and equip programs.
Yeah. So I called some of the rebel commanders who've been on that program for years when the announcement came out, and no one had told them. They saw it in the media.
Wow. It's embarrassing, really.
It's just like, what it really reinforces is this idea that I think has been reinforced throughout the war. Like, anybody who throws their lot with the Americans is going to eventually be probably killed or run out of the country because the U.S. support. Like, I think it was the case with the rebels, right? Who had U.S. backing. It's the case now with the Kurds. And it was the case with like the pro-democracy activists who were getting State Department training and the white helmets and all these people. It's like, I kind of always have this heartbreaking feeling, or at least early in the war, like when I'm talking to Syrians who consider America to be like their natural ally and listen to like the rhetoric that's coming from like the Obama administration saying they support the protesters, and then watching like State Department money come into the country. Like they think that they maybe by aligning with the American cause, like they're going to have this protection, like they're, like global citizens of the new Rome, But actually it's the opposite. Like, it just puts a target on their backs, and American support is only like to a degree, right? And over the entire war, like the U.S. has just really looked on as like anybody who worked with America has been targeted by every side, right? The regime, the other rebel groups, the ISIS, like they've all been sort of like systematically, driven out of the country and killed by this point.
Yeah, now, the Kurds are feeling it as well, unfortunately. That's the way it is. Mike, is there anything else you think you want to talk about here that we haven't covered?
No, that's it, man. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're reading the book. If any of your listeners pick it up, I appreciate it if you guys leave a review on Goodreads or Amazon, and I'm just happy to have people kind of paying attention and checking it out.
Yeah, man, definitely. Well, thank you very much for sending it. I've been reading your work for years, man. So when I picked the book up, it was nice to read it in that context. I mean, I've nowhere near finished, man. I think I've done like the first chapter. But it's like nice to read it in that context of like, this is a book, rather than you having to get everything in the article. You know, it's a very different way of writing. It feels to me more like a long form, like magazine piece kind of style. Do you know what I mean? Like, I definitely think people should buy it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's great, man.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot, man. It's nice to be able, after covering it from a news perspective for so long, it's nice to be able to just say, okay, what do I want to say? What do people need to know that I know in order to have the understanding that I do of what's going on out there?
Exactly.
So I had a chance just to kind of unwind and do that. It's really nice.
And if people want to buy it, where's the best place to get it? Amazon or what?
Amazon. Amazon's the best place. Or Barnes and Noble is also a good spot. And,
is it out? It's not out yet, right?
It's out. It's out in the U.S. The publication date in the UK is November 28th.
Yeah, mate. If people want to get hold of you, where can they do that? Twitter, all of that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, and then on my Twitter bio, you can see my email address. And so if anybody checks out the book or has thoughts otherwise on coverage, I'm always happy to hear from people. Actually, I made like a lot of nice connections so far, with just people who have read the book and are interested and get in touch. So
brilliant. Okay, Mike. Thank you very much, mate.
All right, thanks a lot, man.
That was Mike Giglio speaking about ISIS oil, Iraqi special forces, smuggling from Turkey to Syria. Definitely do check his book out, Shatter the Nations. And if you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, as always, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. The higher it gets on there, the more work we can do. Go to patreon.com/popularfront. You get loads of extras like bonus episodes, narrated articles, access to the Discord, which is like a big research hub now. It's amazing. So yeah, patreon.com/popularfront. Thank you very much to splicingBlock.com. They edited the sound on this episode for us. Definitely check them out if you need any sound editing, all of that. They're very cheap and very good. So yeah, splicingBlock.com. Not very cheap, I should say, very affordable. You know what I'm saying? This episode was sponsored by the defensepost.com, defense with an S. Check them out. I think the editor just got back from Syria, so they should have some coverage, good coverage there soon. Defensepost.com, defense with an S. Follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/popular.front. And be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. Our new documentary, Ad Oil, about the Hong Kong protesters. The first part is up on the YouTube now, so youtube.com/popularfront. Check that out. Let us know what you think about it. Comment in there as well. Thumbs up, all of that. Press the bell to get notifications. Also on Twitter, we're twitter.com/popularfrontco. Or my Twitter is at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. Or you can go on the website, www.popularfront.co. Thank you very much to the following Patreons: Adam Bergsnyder, Axel Iverson, Azad, Brian McLaughlin, Chad Walker, Christina Ravetti, Christopher Martin, Craig Miller, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Diana Gorvanek, Eloise Larson, Emiliano, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Jack Mayhoff, James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Josh Juan Hernandez, Kay Hardy Roberts, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Lika Madik, Moody Al-Rashid, Noah, Ari from the Discord, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormack from What Bitcoin Did, Q-Ball, Russia Al-Akidi, Rohan Abare, Ryan Sandercock, Scartoon Music, Scott Jonesy, Sebastian from the Discord, Sentry, Sarushe Hawazi, Stephen Davila, STV, Swanson, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, Vida Provost, and Zachary Hinch. Thank you very much. If you want to support us, go to patreon.com/popularfront. As I said, it really helps. Also, what does help, and you can look cool doing it, www.popularfront.shop. That is the shop. That's where you can get, all the Popular Front merchandise, and it really helps us keep going because, as I've said 100 times, this is all grassroots. We're doing this through crowdfunding, through subscriptions, through sponsorship, through merchandise. So far, we've not had any corporate investment at all, and that's not going to change. So if you want to support us, please do patreon.com/popularfront. music in this episode. The intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Check his music out at soundcloud.com/son-of-old.